to start the recording. Thank you, Stella. And so I'll do a very brief introduction because I think everybody's aware that this upcoming meeting of the WTO Ministerial Conference in March is going to be very important. Everybody's well aware of the challenges facing the trading system. And so rather than listen to me make some general remarks, I think it would be better if we just get straight into our program. We're fortunate this afternoon, this morning, or this evening, depending where you are, to have Valerie Picard from the International Chamber of Commerce, who's going to make a presentation around the paper, which has been circulated to you from the International Chamber of Commerce, setting out the views of the international business community. And we have two discussants, Hamid Mamdouh and Stuart Harbinson. And they require no introduction. They're longtime features in this group and discussion. My gosh, I've known them both since, well, I can't remember, a long time. And I would just note that Stuart also has circulated a paper, which if you haven't read it yet, I commend it to you. I think it's a very good piece. So we're going to have Valerie first, speaking for 15 minutes. And thank you very much for joining us, Valerie. And that will be followed by 15 minutes for each of our two discussants. We'll start with Hamid Mamdouh, and we'll go on to Stuart Harbinson. And then we will have 40 minutes for discussion among the group and questions. And so I think, so I hope our presenters will keep their presentations to about 15 minutes each so that we do have time to allow this broader discussion, because I'm sure this is a subject on which other members and other participants in this discussion will have views and will not be shy about expressing them. So with that, welcome to you all again. And Valerie, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm actually in Abu Dhabi at the WCO. I'm attending the WCO Tech Conference. So it's fun to straddle both worlds, where coming from one very sort of nuts and bolts discussions on getting the goods across the border and to this one. I think the paper was shared ahead of this call, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, but each time I say that, I talk too much. And I realize some of you are more familiar with the contents than others, but just to take a step back, and I think just to start out, this call to action that we put out, first of all, it builds on obviously longstanding advocacy from ICC for and in support of the multilateral trading system, and that really remains core. And to this, and I think it's important to say, really remains a core from our business community as well across the globe. There's really no water there in terms of what business would like to see. And so when we had put out the paper that we had done for the last ministerial, we had started off with a diagnostic of the systemic challenges that we were seeing at the time. And so when we put out this call to paper, we thought, let's quickly revisit this diagnosis. Are we still where we are? The answer was, of course, yes, in terms of the issues we had identified at the time, which I know this group knows well, in terms of issues around the lack of leadership on these issues, in terms of a step back, in terms of traditional leadership on coming from on these issues, increasing complexity of trade policy issues, all the trade and digital and trade and environment. It's just getting just more complex business models. That we had already seen that perhaps the common purpose was no longer common due to an increasing diversity of views among members, and just failures across three vital functions that again this group knows well. But I think what's of course changed from the last ministerial was one, we can say, is there is now an alarming level of disregard for the rules of the system that we hadn't, there's always, obviously been, and that is one thing. And that really the loss of stability and predictability, which was, we all know, and was front in headlines in the last year, which is really has impacted businesses across the world and has so really brought these issues to really there is a real sense of urgency that I cannot, well, let me phrase it another way, that I can't stress enough from the perspective of the global business community, because as all of this is happening, business is continuing. And so the businesses are facing every day the very real challenges. And so that is something we hear. Now, so fast forward to where we are today. We felt, and through extensive consultations with our business network, I think the first step was also being realistic about where we are today and what can be achieved. And so we tried to do, in terms of the next ministerial, is to really create a very targeted call to action that we think is achievable. And what do I mean by that is, what we really would like to see, and I know many of you have heard us and have read the paper and have seen, is what we would want is for MC14 to really be the kickoff for these structured, time-bound discussions that on WTO around all these issues that really need to be had. And I know there have been some discussions, but really not in that sort of structured way from a holistic perspective. We do realize, and I think we say this in the paper, that consensus may be elusive. John and I were just talking about that. And so really also very much looking to a coalition of the willing to get these discussions off the ground. And we do have to say that we have, and we can talk about this, is the EU proposal, which is now on the table, so there is now something concrete going towards this. So we very welcome that step forward. The other thing that we very much emphasize is that, this will not be a surprise coming from ICC, but the private sector needs to be not only a partner during all of these reform discussions that will move forward, but also we need to be an outcome of the reform, because the WTO, and I know it's we can discuss the how, the what, and the where, but there is no structured mechanism for business input. The WTO public forum, of course, is very welcome, but that is not how, and that is not a structured way to gather input and to support the discussions that are happening in Geneva. And we think we're leaving a lot of opportunities on the table through that. So there's a way to do that. It doesn't mean opening the door and having private sector run rampant through the halls of the WTO. There are obviously discussions where it wouldn't be appropriate, but there is ways of doing that so that we can come and work constructively alongside on a more day-to-day basis. Obviously, the words around variable geometry, which I know have been heard, and that coming to that point is, as the private sector, we also recognize that 2026 is not 1995. It's obvious, very obvious statement, but sometimes we do need to get there. And so to again, coming back to being realistic, we need to introduce the flexibilities into the system to be able to save or to preserve its entirety. I'm sorry for those of you who've already heard me say this, but sometimes I like to say, the metaphor that I find quite useful is that, it's like in a storm when you've got the trees that have very, very thick trunks. When you wake up in the morning, they're the ones who have, that are lying across the road. But the trees that have still enough flexibility to bend while their roots are firmly pointed, still firmly in the ground, survive. So we're not talking about, à la carte, but enough flexibility to save the system while preserving the whole. And there needs to be discussions. I'm not saying we have all the solutions there whatsoever, but those discussions need to be had. And of course, we would like to see, while those discussions go on, a standstill on new trade restrictive measures, And finally, for the ministerial, it wouldn't be a ministerial if without the moratorium. So that is also, of course, something that we are calling for in parallel. All this to say is, is coming to, and I think the question is how. That's sort of the what, and then there's the question of the how. So in the statement, this is what we had put out in our call to action, was an annex where we had a proposed sequence of issues that was, modestly put there. And we see that where we said, well, there's got to be a starting point, and there's got to be a way to do this in a way that makes sense. It doesn't mean hierarchy. That's not at all what but really around, is there a sequence? And so in addition to the starting point being about, are we all moving towards the same goal? This issue around the common purpose. There's also making sure we all agree on certain of the foundational principles, which I do have to say from a business perspective, I cannot emphasize enough how much that MFN principle, even it remains core to business priorities. And again, what we saw, and I think what probably this group knows better than I can speak to, so I won't, but where we had identified in the paper was where we see is very much the three priorities areas, which are no surprises around the decision-making, the special and differential treatment, and very much the plurilaterals, which to the private sector are the future around the negotiating agenda. And at the same time, so this can happen in parallel, and I hope it's is addressing the other systemic reforms that need to happen to enable functioning WTO. And there I would put, of course, creating the role for business, addressing the dispute settlement, issues around deliberative and monitoring function. These can happen in parallel. We can, but the need to move forward. And once we can unblock the negotiating agenda, then we can finally get to updating the rule book. And I cannot, we had. I had come to Geneva in June with a business delegation, and we'd had meetings, and it was really clear at the time. We'd had some great discussions around trade and digital, trade and environment, but our conclusion at the end was, if we don't unlock, and at the time around those threshold issues, we can't unlock the rule book. And it's not in any way because the rule book isn't important. Business, of course, is desperate to have those rules updated and brought forward into the 21st century, but we need to find a way to get there. And so is very supportive of the process to allow us to unblock that. Again, I'm just going to emphasize from the business perspective the absolute urgency to act. As I said at the start, business is happening every day. It can't wait. It's so, and it's becoming, I constantly hear about, the increase in barriers, and this is coming from all sides, and the challenges and how difficult it is, and of course, particularly for the small businesses throughout our network. So there's a real sense of urgency to move forward. And there's an impact on inaction. This does not come at no cost. And so, as we know, it's for all the reasons we all know: more uncertainty, more fragmentation, and more cost and complexity. As we said, at last year when there was a lot of churning, and there was a lot of during all of this uncertainty, what the business is doing nothing is not a business strategy, and so business has to find a way forward. So really, again, so from our perspective, though, it comes back to, and I think if there's a positive message we keep hearing, is the global business community continues to support the WTO. They want to see it thrive. It is indispensable. It's not perfect, but it's absolutely needed from the global business perspective. So how do we move forward? And I think I referred to it, what we want to see, again, coalition of the willing. And I think for us, I'm sorry to be a bit basic, but there's a choice of, do we want to see a rules-based system? Well, if the answer is yes, then for us, again, we need to move forward. And there's a choice to be made. We recognize, of course, there needs to be safeguards in any process. We speak, needs to be inclusive. we of course understand it's the start of a negotiation, and there's going to be long and very difficult discussions that need to be had. But again, we want to kickstart and create that environment to have those difficult discussions. And of course, again, that requires political will. So from an ICC perspective, we are, you see me and I'm sitting here, and well, usually I sit in Paris, but our entire network is very actively engaged in discussions in capitals as well, with all of their ministries and trade officials, and sending the same messages to help mobilize political will. And of course, understanding again this need for the variable geometry that we saw in the EU statement and is now heard quite across the way. So with that, I think I think that's it. I will stop there I think I'm at time, and I will hand it back, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Valerie. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure it's given a lot of food for thought. And let me congratulate you also, because you're in under time by about a minute and a half, I think. So that's great. And let me see. So we now turn to Hamid Mamdouh. So Hamid, over to you.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Valerie, for the excellent presentation. I certainly would remind everyone, of course, that it's important to hear from ICC, because our business community is really the end users of the system that we have. And we would recall from the Uruguay round days, and I'm sure, John, you would remember that as well, that building this system was in close cooperation with a lot of business interlocutors in the real world, who helped construct the system in a way that is basically commensurate and responding to the needs of the business community at the time. Excuse me. Now, of course, the crisis now that we have is the absence of predictability. This is the biggest problem. I mean, we keep talking about tariffs and what percentage and what is the news coming out of Washington today, and what deals are being done and all that. But actually, the biggest damage that is happening systemically is the erosion of predictability and stability, and this is how businesses make their investment decisions. Now, the reality of what we have, and also Valerie referred to that, is that the landscape has shifted dramatically. We have been operating since 1995 on the basis of the single undertaking, which was basically constructed on the basis of a certain negotiated balance of rights and obligations that we had arrived to as a result of the Uruguay round. Now, since the landscape has shifted substantially, that balance is no longer valid. And we are still operating on the basis of the old contract. And I think one of the important, sad realities, but important to realize as well, is that the current contract that we have now is broken. And it is not just broken because of what happened recently. It is broken also structurally because it no longer suits the kind of situation that the global trade and investment landscape is at now. And it is actually a problem that is time sensitive. Now, of course, Valerie also referred to the urgency of acting, but I think in reality also we need to pay attention to the fact that the mere passage of time in the current situation we're in a way normalizes dysfunction. It not only reduces the credibility or erodes the credibility of the system, but it becomes a normal state of affairs that we don't have a rules-based functioning system. And that, I think, means that with every delay to put together a structured effort to address the crisis, the cost of reform in the end is just going to continue to rise as time passes by. Now, we also need to realize here, I think, that what we're looking at is a structural problem. The fact that the landscape has shifted and we're still stuck with the old contract means that it is a structural problem that requires a structural solution. It is not a problem that we can get around simply by inducing behavioral changes. That's not going to solve the problem in reality. It is important to realize, because that's what brings us to the kind of ideas that you find in the paper in relation to variable geometry and the need to have a different kind of, not just treaty architecture, but I think the content of the treaty itself would need to be updated. So there are two dimensions here to this effort. It's the structure and the content. Now, of course, from a sort of a sentimental point of view, or not sentimental only, but also we look at what is ideal all the time. But I think now we have to look at what is possible and what is feasible. It is not feasible and it's not possible that things will go back to where they were. And I think this has been made abundantly clear. So we need to look at basically what comes next. Now, the call for action is a call for a structured agenda. But what I would add here as well is that the kind of agenda that is needed here is, in my view, need not just be an agenda for discussion. I think it should be a structured agenda for negotiation. Now, I see, maybe I'm looking at it from a slightly specialized point of view, but I see a difference between discussions and negotiations. A discussion is a discussion of substantive issues, and then at the end of the day, everyone expresses their views, and then we might have takeaways, we might have outcomes. But a negotiation basically means clear objectives, clear modalities, and clear timelines. Now, MC14, of course, is the opportunity here, and I think it would be a great loss of opportunity if nothing happens at MC14, or at MC14 we get just a simple paragraph like we got out of MC13 saying, okay, we're committed to reform. We have been talking about reform now for almost 10 years. I was advising the presidency of the G20 6 years ago, in 2020, when it was Saudi Arabia, and the heads of states of the G20 endorsed the Riyadh initiative on the future of the WTO, but none of that has actually filtered through to the discussions in the WTO. The positive and encouraging thing that we see now is what's happening inside the WTO with the work of the facilitator, but also the submissions that we've had. We've had a US submission, which I think is quite revealing in where the US wants to go, and we should respect that. It's a sovereign choice. And there is another submission from the EU, which is more articulated towards the taking the route of negotiations that would have the kind of features that we're talking about. Of course, this is going to be different this time. If we're going to have liftoff on any of that, it is highly unlikely, almost impossible, that there will be consensus. So at the end of the day, there has to be a political choice. And this is the time of a political choice here. Who wants a rules-based trading system? And it is a choice that should be respected, basically. And this is not about acting in hostility towards anyone. It's about actually enabling those countries who want whatever they want to go about it. If you want a rules-based system, then that's a route to be taken. If that's not a priority for you, also that should be a respected choice. But I think now it's the clarity of choices, not about forcing anyone to do one thing or the other. And this is the most important thing, because again, at the end of the day, what we have in the WTO is a very precious infrastructure, treaty and institutional infrastructure. And if we let it slip away, I'm not sure that within the next generation or two, we will be able to establish or reconstruct anything that looks like it. So our opportunity now is to have something coming out of the current treaty architecture and content that we have in the form of a new contract, as I said. So in a way, just put this in a sort of a bit of a more sort of brief way, we should not really be thinking just about the future of the WTO, but we should be thinking about the WTO of the future, which will look different from this one. But we have to embrace those challenges, I think, with a lot of hope, but also embracing the challenge because it brings with it opportunities. The last point I would make here, because I'm trying to beat Valerie on time saving, is the sequence of issues. I think this is critical because if you look at the ICC paper and the annex, it focuses on the cross-cutting institutional issues. And I think that's a terribly important point because these are issues that pop up everywhere. And we're distinguishing between those and the sort of transactional items of business, whether it's agriculture, fisheries subsidies, industrial subsidies, other issues relating to level playing field or services or digital trade. The issues you find in the annex, which are focused on the three functions of the WTO, are about those issues that need to be unblocked so that it would facilitate progress on other issues. And if you look at the negotiating function, for example, you see that perhaps this needs to be addressed with a bit of priority, because if you don't enable the negotiating platform in the WTO to function, I'm not sure we'll get anywhere on anything. And so this is something I think that would need to be sort of kept in mind. And it's not just a question of what is more important than what. It's about the sequencing and what might need to be addressed before. Let me stop here. And as you said, John, I think that we would expect a lot of comments and questions. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. And you've given us 5 minutes extra for the discussion period. So thank you. And without further ado, let me turn to Stuart.
Thanks very much indeed, John. And it's a pleasure to be with you on this panel today. I think, first of all, I really do want to say how much I appreciate the ICC's steadfast support for the WTO over the years. So really big thanks to Valerie and also to Hamid, of course, for this latest iteration. I was at one stage actually a member of the Commission on Trade and Investment, so I know well how much effort goes into the ICC's work in this area. It's a big organization, and distilling everything down into such a condensed and understandable message is not easy. There's no doubt without this continuous support, the WTO would be, in an even more parlous situation than it is now. And the latest call for action, I think, contains some great advice from a business perspective, which, as Valerie said, is something that we really need. I was particularly struck by the idea that MC14 should be seen as, I think, what they call a lifesaver opportunity to salvage the rules-based system and thereby secure the jobs, the investment, and the growth that we all depend on. As far as my own views on WTO reform are concerned, I think in the interests of brevity and also clarity, I will just make 3 broad points very quickly, and perhaps rather crudely, actually, for which I apologize in advance. But hopefully that will at least stimulate some comments and questions. The first point that I want to make is that I believe too much responsibility or blame, if you like, is being placed on the organization, i.e. the WTO. There seems to be, in my view, a naive tendency to think that a few institutional tweaks can solve all of our problems. This is what I've previously called a cargo cult approach. That is, if we can just find the right magic, everything will automatically flow to our benefit. We all know that this is not true. Although the WTO certainly does have its faults, the problems in the trading system stem mainly from policy choices by national governments, not from the WTO. And we all have our favorite illustrations. I mean, I can give you an idea of what my favorites are. First of all, India put its foot on the throat of the institution by blocking Annex 4 plurilaterals. There again, many of the participants in the fisheries subsidies negotiations simply are not willing to give up existing or potential harmful subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And then thirdly, of course, the US simply ignores its commitments and is also very, very happy to appeal dispute cases into the void. These are all policy choices by the members concerned, and I don't see how the WTO should have to accept the blame for the consequences. It's certainly part of the function of the institution to act as a lightning conductor to release some of the tension around trade disputes, but it's a relatively weak institution which we should not overload. The second big point or broad point that I'd like to make is that, in my view, this is the worst possible time to embark on reforming the WTO. It seems obvious to me anyway that the direction of reform in the present environment can only be towards weakening the institution. And Exhibit A in this respect is the US submission on WTO reform, which could really have been called WTO ruination or WTO destruction. It's notable that the US offers no view of the WTO's place in the trading system after so-called reform. It appears that the foundational MFN principle is to be completely discarded. The remnants of the dispute settlement system will be even further dismantled by the complete unchallengeability for anything remotely connected in the mind of any member with security. There would be a blank check for networks of discriminatory plurilateral agreements, which would effectively be run by the major trading partners, and the Secretariat would be administrative only, and whole areas of trade policy would be off limits. In my book, I'll call it what it is. I think this is vandalism. The WTO would become completely irrelevant. The US apparently only sees it as a repository for notifications, but who would bother to notify anything to such a useless organization? It may be said that the many well-meaning middle powers, to use Mark Carney's term, will be able to put a brake on all of this. And to some extent that may be so, but the track record so far doesn't fill us with confidence. The initial reaction has often been to yield at least some ground. And in any debate on WTO reform, we all know that the US will have to be accommodated, to some extent perhaps to a significant extent. My third and last point, John, relates to Mark Carney's dictum that, quote, nostalgia is not a strategy, unquote. Don't get me wrong, his speech at Davos was absolutely excellent, I thought. But this one aspect of it was, in my view, questionable. I'm not sure where this phrase, nostalgia is not a strategy, comes from. I actually first noticed it in an essay on the trading system by Michael Froman last year. Although Michael Froman had never previously struck me as a particular enemy of the WTO, he promoted the idea in that essay that the WTO should, as I think he put it, wither away and die. This perhaps illustrates that the anti-WTO sentiment in Washington is both strong and bipartisan. So let's not expect things to improve there anytime soon. The message from Michael Froman was to give up on the WTO and let it fade away. That's what he meant by nostalgia is not a strategy. It's therefore quite surprising, or it was to me, to hear something similar from Mark Carney. Taken literally, I think nostalgia is not a strategy makes perfect sense. But there seems to be a subtext. A subtext is that that we should give up on what is a hopelessly lost cause. I don't think this is what Mark Carney really meant. At least I hope not. Martin Wolf in the FT the other day, as I hope some of you noticed, made a very strong case that the post-Second World War period was on the whole a period of unprecedented success. And I think we need to bear that in mind. So nostalgia may not be a strategy, but resisting vandalism is a strategy. Defending what we have so painstakingly achieved is a strategy. Standing up for our principles is a strategy. So on that note, I rest my case. Thank you.
Very good, Stuart. Excellent remarks. So the floor is now open. I don't see anybody asking for the floor yet. I was going to say that maybe it would be good if someone could say a few words about the EU proposal, since it's been referred to. But I noticed for some reason we don't seem to have any of our former EU colleagues on the call at this point. So maybe maybe they don't like the EU paper. I don't know. But well, while we wait for somebody to screw up their courage, let me say a couple of things then. And I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think though the problem right now is one of timing. That if we that in the effort to try to have a successful, in quotes, I use the term because everybody seems to always think we should have successful ministerial conferences. In the effort to have a successful ministerial conference, if we were going to do that, then I think, well, if success meant reaching a consensus declaration of some sort or approach to how to proceed, I think we would probably destroy the organization in the process of achieving that. And for the reasons that have already been laid out. So I must say, I think it's important. I think this is a question, as I think maybe it was, as Hamid said, it's a question of political choice as to how people want to proceed. And my sense from listening to what the various players are saying, and perhaps more importantly, watching what they're doing, that there is a real gap here of enormous breadth between the choices that some members want and the choices that other members want. So it seems to me that what we need to do at this point, rather than try and find a compromise way forward right now, we really need to try to set out positions clearly as to what we want. And if we have a reasonably large group of members who can reach some kind of consensus among them on the way forward, and that there is importance, the system is worth saving, and some reform is necessary, then I think it would be important to state that clearly in a way that could serve as a rallying point for business communities around the world, and would give an opportunity for reflection to those who are interested in the system to think about what do we really need to try and move things forward. Now, to put not too fine a point on it, one of the biggest problem at the moment, I think, is trying to figure out how to engage the American administration in a constructive discussion about how to preserve and strengthen the WTO. However, I'm encouraged by Valerie's paper. I'm encouraged by other statements we see coming from the American business community. I think the American business community does see value in the WTO system, does see value in the MFN principle. And I think we need to give this some time. I'm not sure that a year from now or 2 years from now that Americans are going to be satisfied that Donald Trump's trade policy is one which is a recipe for the economic success of the United States. And if that turns out to be the case, then we're going to see some important shifts in terms of American trade policy. And if, on the other hand, we've decided in the near future that it's better to try and figure out how to reach agreement to move forward, then I think we run the risk that we're going to use Stuart's word, vandalize the system. And I agree with what Hamid said. If this system collapses, then it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to put it back together again in a form at all close to what we now have. So I think those who are now the custodians of this system should think very carefully about whether it's more important to stand up for their principles, declare what those principles are, and establish a beacon for going forward, or whether it's more important to try and reach agreement now and recognize that that will involve making important concessions in terms of the level of value that the organization now has. So I've been a bit aggressive there, but this, I see, at least we've now got 3 more people who want to speak. So part of the purpose has been achieved. So I turn to Alan Wolf.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the 3 speakers who give us a lot to work with. I'm not a great fan of ministerials of recent years. The one that I participated in from the inside most recently was Buenos Aires, and Azevedo came out of that meeting and he said to the public, well, we failed completely. And we hadn't, because the joint statement initiatives were born, and they held great promise, and they produced. They're not earth-shaking, each of them, but they made progress, and still making progress. I'm struck a lot by what Stuart had to say. A question is how to get on the table, for example, which is in the EU paper, for example, and some of it may not be even controversial. What's the value of what's been achieved? Someone should go out and it could be a working group, a working party, a smaller group, something like customs valuation. The U.S. Wants to set tariffs at whatever rate it wants. It wants to give them to whatever country it wants to give them to on any day it wants to give it to them. So there is no stability. But does it really want to have customs valuation random? The U.S. won't be able to deal with that. It may think it can, but it can't. No country can have the entire system that's been built up disintegrate. So there's vandalization, vandalizing, as Stuart has said, but it attacks certain things. It can't attack everything. Do you want SPS? The U.S. has an interest in SPS. So do other countries. Do you want SPS to disappear? Do you want the standards agreement not to be utilized any further? There are a million ways in which countries can discriminate, and they will if allowed total freedom. So one thing is a stock taking. I don't know that one declares that. I don't know how it's achieved. To declare it is to get someone to stand up and say, well, I don't agree. I don't think that's worth having. So I don't know what can come out of Cameroon, but I consider going past Cameroon to having without much of a mandate, at least me in the financial crisis had a mandate for bulking up transparency. The U.S. shouldn't be against transparency. No country should be against transparency, but somebody will. So the Secretariat, first of all, the U.S. is highly transparent. We do all kinds of discriminatory things and tweet them in the middle of the night. So there's no problem with transparency, but it has to be recorded someplace. Someone has to be keeping a record of what's out there that the EU, for all of its vaunted love of the rules, has knuckled under because of Ukraine, because of a nuclear umbrella in Japan. The Japanese have gone along, but transparency should be salvaged and improved, increased. So maybe a secret group could be formed of those who work behind the scenes to say what actually can be preserved, what can be improved. I sent out something that I'm sure has no adherence whatsoever since it has been an MPIA now for almost half a dozen years or 5 years, and it is not greatly in use. Why isn't it in use? The U.S. ambassador during the first Trump administration, Dennis Shea, said, let's first discuss what went wrong before we can discuss fixing anything. Now we neither want to discuss what went wrong nor fixing anything. So, but someone should. Was binding dispute settlement of value? Is it of value? I don't know how one comes at it and gets a working group started, but in any event, I think there's a lot of analysis to be done that can't be done just by individuals writing blog posts that should be in some group. If there were a real Ottawa group pinning this on our host, they would be doing this. The way that the Tokyo round came about in terms of substance was the Williams Commission, 6 years or so of investigation of what non-tariff barriers were, what we were talking about. Well, some of the work has to be done, and I don't know that it can be established at Cameroon. I'll desist from saying anything further now, but thanks for sparking this discussion by the ITC and ICC and Hamid and Stuart. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Alan. Let me point out that Ambassador Matthew Wilson has put forward a very good suggestion for a question that ought to be answered, and it's in the Q&A. But perhaps I could read it out quickly so that you can all think of it. And I do it now because I think it might be useful for our next two speakers to think of whether they would like to address this issue along with whatever else they were going to say too. So the point he makes is, why do the panelists feel major developing countries like China, India, Brazil, and others have not come forward with their own formal papers on reform as ACP and AG have? If the statistics have not shown any real growth for developing countries outside of China and a few others, from membership, can we surmise that as WTO stands today, it is not delivered for growth? And if so, should it not be dramatically reformed? Understanding that the equal playing field will mean small countries are on the back foot. So I throw that out, and thank you, Ambassador Wilson. And Maria, over to you.
Well, I wish I could answer Ambassador Wilson's question. I don't, the only thing that quickly comes to mind is with respect to India, which was alluded to earlier. I mean, I think they seem to be extremely happy with the status quo, which is why they, have this notion of blocking, plurilaterals. But, it is a question that we should all be thinking about. Another question, I think that the question that Alan posed on is binding dispute settlement of value is one that we should take up, and I'm not going to dwell on it now. I think most people know I've spoken about this. I think all in all, it's done has more downsides than upsides, but I know that that's debatable, but it is something that is worth thinking about. I wasn't going to dwell on that. It's just that Alan, may put that point forward, and I think that maybe this group should have a colloquy about that at some point. I was going to react to Stuart's points. Wholeheartedly agree on point number one, that too much blame is placed on the WTO, and I'm not going to dwell on it because I agree with what he said. On whether this is a time to embark on reform, I actually think that that's a really good point. And I tend to agree with what he's saying, not just because I'm not sure the United States is in the mood to be terribly constructive. I'm not sure that they're in the mood to be destructive either. I've said this before. I think on tariffs is just a special case for our president. And so, yes, vandalism is probably the correct term for what the United States is doing with respect to tariffs. But there are other pieces of the WTO that I think the administration, or at least parts of the administration, do like. And so, again, I think that, the tariff issue is just a special, problem for the United States right now. I do think that, another reason why reform, maybe it's not the worst time, maybe there's never a good time, is, again, the reason that others have alluded to, which is, everybody wants something different. And I don't know, I mean, I went through 2 ministerials where we had this issue on the plate, and we were only able to come up with, just a few sentences. I'm not sure that the membership has gotten to a point where they can figure out, how to truly move forward. And, one of the things that I've always been advocating is it got a bad name of reform by doing, but it's, the more important part of reform is how each member acts, in the organization, and how they, cooperate or not cooperate, in the decision making without changing the decision making rules. So again, I don't think that we're going to see, sadly, I don't think that we're going to see much coming out of reform from the ministerial, but I think it's not just because of the US. I think it's because, again, it's the usual, you start looking at the papers and it's everything under the sun, and then nothing moves forward. On the last point of nostalgia is not a strategy, I view that in a different way. I think, to me, because I did relate to that point, because to me, what it meant to me, or what it means to me, is just saying that the rules are good and the rules are great and we should just stick to them doesn't solve the problem. And so that it's just pining for, or weren't things great? And I agree. I think that the system has produced others, and maybe this goes to Matthew's question. Maybe there are others in the membership that have different opinions about that, whether it has produced for them or not. But the question is, and this was, something Hamid said earlier, it's not what is the future of the WTO, but what is the WTO of the future? I think that's how you put it. And I think that is where we should be putting a lot of our energy. I honestly don't believe that MFN is the most important thing. Sorry, that's my opinion. I think it's certainty. I would put certainty above MFN per se. And I think that certainly is where the United States is doing vandalism, with respect to our own, tariff schedule, even if we're just looking at it domestically. So, that would be the thing that I would put at the core of, what is the future? And how do we get the United States administration back to believing in the value of that? And here, my last point, the ICC obviously has, a better pulse on where the business community is. I know that there's some, the agricultural community has always, in the United States, has always been very supportive of the WTO, and I think they're fairly vocal. I'm not sure that many other industries are. Through the trade associations, yes, but I'm not sure that there's a lot of U.S. businesses that are going to where they need to go to, USTR and the president, and saying, this is a valued, organization, you need to preserve it, or you need to stick with it, or, whatever. Again, I could be completely wrong on that, but I just don't get the sense that is happening. And, and I think that is, one of the things that needs to happen. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Maria. Very thoughtful presentation. And we turn to our executive director.
Thanks, John.
Chief Executive Officer. What is your title again, Lou?
Well, I mean, the board titled me as a CEO, Chief Executive Officer, makes me more like a billionaire operating a big company on the ICC instead of a WTO reform think tank. But anyway, that's something I have got. But coming back to the discussion first, of course, a lot of thanks to Valerie, Hamid, and also Stuart for really good presentations, especially about the ICC paper. For those who have been following our discussion, I think many points in that paper resonates a lot with what we are discussing here. Lack of leadership, the need for new coalition of the willing, variable geometry, plurilateral, so on and so forth. So I think that's really something very important for our group to know. The reason we are doing this and with the ICC paper is because MC14 is coming. Whether we like it or not, MC still stands as the meeting where ministers get together and discuss or potentially make decisions. So I think that's why there's a lot of attention on MC14 and also on what we can do. John, about what you said in your intervention is about, in my word, to simplify it, is that do we preserve or do we reform? For me, I don't think these two are mutually exclusive. For me, the factor is very much on how you do it instead of whether you do one, not the other. We have discussed about the dire situation, the crisis and everything. I think we have been saying, and I myself have been saying since end of 2024, is that we need to jump out of the box. What I tout it as thinking about the unthinkable, and also for MCs. All the ICC paper, what Hamid said about the launch a new reform agenda, and also what Stewart has said with, especially his ending notes about the danger, the crisis we are facing too, is very much on what the other members, the coalition of the willing, the middle powers, how they react, how they take actions, and what they do about WTO and the system. So I think that's a key point. So for me, if those members under the able convener, I think Hamid emphasized a lot that one convener or a small group of conveners to group together those middle powers, and there will be a lot of things they can do together in a plurilateral format, reaffirming basic principles like MFN, and reaffirming their commitment to the system, and reaffirming their determination to move ahead in small groups, and also to have a frank discussion among themselves about the whole list of issues ICC paper has put forward. And I think that would be very, very important. I mean, DG is going to have also, she called it, I think, a structural discussions. But I think a smaller group in a quieter room, more candid, and would be also serve the purpose. And also, more importantly, this small group could also, I mean, the WTO facilitate Norwegian ambassador is pushing forward for working program on WTO reform, but the coalition of the willing can also do the same. And with also a kind of follow-up at both political level, technical level, timelines, and so on, objectives, so on. That will also be important to as a plan B. And also, there are a lot of plurilaterals they can work on. I mean, ICC paper has put forward, just to add one point I said a lot, is that environment. There are many things small group members can do. The MPIA, I heard, I proposed, and I also heard some discussion on the MPI expansion, in institutionalization or legislation. Legislation means that to better the rules, to make it more operation, or more operation in a better way. And also like what Matthew has put forward in his question, is that how do we structure everything with a focus also on development on the small and vulnerable countries. So those will also be the key, that when we are moving ahead as a coalition of the willing, we do not leave the majority of small and vulnerable countries behind us. So I think all these things, if we think about in a way and then do it in a flexible, plurilateral way, I think MC14 would be one way or the other a success. Maybe not multilaterally, but plurilaterally, that will still be good news for the world and for the private sector. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Hamid.
If there are other questions, I don't want to get in the way, but if there are no questions, then I thought there are a couple of things that I might want to refer to here. First of all, I think I listened carefully to what Stuart was saying and what others were saying as well about the timing. The question is, in my mind, is what are we waiting for? What are we expecting to change in order to start the process? And what we're talking about at MC14 is just agreeing on an agenda. It's not agreeing on solutions. It's just to agree on an agenda, which should not be difficult to get a structured process starting. And then the focus on the issues of systemic importance fixing the negotiating function and the deliberative function, which are currently dysfunctional. Now, I think from a systemic point of view, you need to fix the plumbing, otherwise you get no flow. And it's important to unblock those functions. Now, these are public good issues. These are not transactional negotiating items where interests actually collide. So there can be some kind of realistic hope that this would happen. I agree, of course, that of course, nostalgia is not a strategy, and hope by itself also is not a strategy. That's why something needs to be done within reasonable limits. Now, within reasonable limits brings me to the point of consensus. I don't think we should realistically expect that something would be agreed by consensus at MC14. It has to be tried. That would need to be the first, I think, value proposition for everyone. But then, if there is no consensus, then those who want a system, this is why I was saying this is a time for a political decision, would need to decide whether they want to start these conversations. It should be, after that, open for everyone and actually encouraging everyone to come along. Now, the elephant in the room here, the US, I think we need to respect the choice of the US. If the US is vandalizing the WTO, well, maybe the US does not wish to see the WTO, or at least in the form that it's in now. Now, this is why we're talking about variable geometry, where we can actually reconfigure the balance of rights and obligations and move away, not move away completely, but not be completely bound by the single undertaking as it's either everything or nothing. This all or nothing approach within the treaty architecture that we have, I think, is becoming a huge handicap, and it's not compatible with the reality that we're facing today. Now, these kind of conversations, if they start in goodwill, by actually saying this is an act of accommodation to the different choices. We're facing the biggest challenge is the increasing diversity and divergence among members. Now, in the face of that reality, having some variable geometry which would reconfigure balance of rights and obligations, you don't need to be bound by all agreements under the single undertaking, for example. But if you're not bound by one agreement, you have no claims under that agreement either. And you're not going to be using the dispute settlement system to invoke rights under the agreement that you're not bound by, nor would it be used against you, right? All these are sort of details that would need to be discussed and ironed out through the negotiations. But what we need at MC14 is just to start these kind of conversations that look at things through the lens of reality. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Hamid. And I see Stuart wants to jump back in as well. And we'll certainly give Valerie another opportunity to get into the discussion before we wind up.
Thanks, John. Well, I mean, like Hamid, if anybody else has got a question, I'm very happy to give way. I mean, I think it's been a great round of comments and some excellent questions raised. I guess we don't really have much time, or enough time to go into all of the ins and outs. But I mean, Matthew's question, the WTO hasn't delivered for growth. It's a great point. I think we should have a session on that, Lou, at some point. I mean, I suppose the question is, why hasn't the WTO been able to deliver for growth? That would be a fascinating one. So Matthew, your question is beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid. I have to duck that one. I mean, Hamid made a great point. I think, what are we waiting for on WTO reform? Why don't we just starting a process? I mean, I do actually see some danger there. I mean, is this a premature time? Is it the external environment is extremely hostile? The WTO does not have a good track record of discussing these abstract concepts and coming to a conclusion within a reasonable time frame, to say the least. We can talk about the consensus principle for at least 5 or 10 years without reaching a conclusion. So the danger that I see is that we create a rod for our own backs. In other words, the discussion goes on and on and on without any conclusion, and the outside world just points their fingers at the WTO and says, look, we told you, they're useless, they can't do anything. So, you know, there are dangers there in starting at the wrong time, quite apart from the external environment. I really like Maria's comment that, you know, just sticking to the current rules doesn't solve the problem. I think she's got a really good point there. And she also said, I think that she's not sure that the US wants to be destructive, although they're a bit vandalistic on tariffs, as I understood it. And that's interesting, I think, because there's a phrase or a little section in the US paper where it says, without any elaboration whatsoever, that the WTO is one of the tools. But they don't say what sort of tool it is and who's going to use it. You know, what are the other tools in the toolbox? That would be interesting if the US were to come forward with some sort of vision of what it is that it sees the WTO doing in future. But they, you know, so far they haven't, and that's why I'm calling them vandals. But I thought it was a great point. Thanks, Maria. I liked Alan's point about stock taking. I think that's an interesting idea. And, you know, there are many, many excellent points. I'll stop there because I don't want to take up too much time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else wish to speak? Oh, Maria jumping back in again. Good. Well, she's been referred to a lot, so that's entirely fair.
No. But just very, very quickly, actually, because on Stuart's comment about Matthew's question, actually, as I was thinking about it, I think, you know, part of the answer, I think, is what Stuart said about putting too much blame on the WTO, right? I mean, some of it, for sure, is because it's individual policy decisions by the members, not the institution itself, right? But anyway, just wanted to add that because as I was thinking about it, I thought, I think you gave the answer earlier on.
Thank you. I guess it seems, you know, I was thinking as we grapple with these with the discussion we're having today, and there are a number of different views, I can sort of imagine, and we're the friends of multilateralism. I was sort of trying to imagine what this discussion might be like among ministers in 8 weeks from now, or exactly how far away it is. And it sort of made me think, you know, this is going to be a very difficult discussion. And I think part of the problem is you need to anticipate the difficulty before 3 a.m. in the morning after the meeting has already been extended for 2 extra days. That's not the right moment then to start thinking about, well, what do we say then? And that's partly why what I said earlier, I think, is really worth thinking about. So some people call it Plan B. I know we had another discussion a while ago where I said maybe Plan B should become Plan A. But whatever, I think it's really important that some careful thought be given to if the multilateral approach is the first one, and that certainly seems to be the direction we're headed in for this meeting, then we need to be thinking, if that doesn't work, what do we do? What do those who still value the system and want to see it succeed say and do? And I think this is something that needs to be worked out to some degree in advance. So that's all. I'm not going to say any more. And Valerie, I think we'll give you the last word, unless what you say provokes somebody else into deciding that they need to, or that they have a contribution that would be worthwhile. So Valerie, please go ahead, and thank you again for your wonderful paper.
Well, thanks, John, and thank you to everyone for the discussion. And I'm not going to try to answer everything. I think there's been, and the word, I think, at least, and I'm speaking from our perspective, from the private sector perspective, is how do we move forward pragmatically? And I think that's really what we're trying to achieve here, and recognizing, again, I come back to this, where we are today. I think that's what we're really trying to achieve. So I think, indeed, MC14 is a point in time. And it's, it's an important calendar moment. But if we can call it coalition of the willing or a working group or whatever way we do it, but to address those really challenging questions, and I'm not, again, emphasizing, we do recognize these are not easy and it's hard, but if that work can be done, we can start to lay the groundwork rather than just sort of, I think that's what we're saying right now. So I think Lou said it, and I had been thinking that is, why do we have to make a choice, necessarily in terms of sort of moving it forward if possible? Sure somebody here will refute that, but I will put that there. Second thing I just wanted to also say, in terms of perhaps speaking to Matthew's question, was also just as a reminder that we had done and so I of course agree that it's, as always, these things have multiple reasons, but we did do the study on what would happen if there was no WTO, and it did show very much, at least that there is a lot to safeguard, in terms of the economic impact on developing economies. So we would, and what we had seen across the board was that, without the rules, without the WTO, the 33% drop in exports, the 5% hit to GDP over 5 years, and so forth. So, all of this would certainly have an economic impact. So, can there be progress? 100%. Finally, I just wanted to say also from the private sector perspective, and so we are hearing from our members, and so they're not always, can't emphasize how much everyone is really busy this year firefighting, but they have said to us, that's why your role is so important, so I wouldn't be here today if they, without them behind us, and I think what they're saying is, so again, I know it's, and I think the U.S. Chamber has actually put out some things as well, some helpful statements. So just want to say is I do think behind those big companies, but also, and really importantly, the small ones, and they're not, and that's again why we're here. And as always, big companies will find ways to manage. It'll be harder and more expensive, but it's the smaller ones who are going to be the most injured in all of this. They're the ones who don't even know about the WTO. They don't even know, to the point about what Alan raised, and I'll end with this, about everything that the WTO does. So I'm not trying, so just to point, and that's why we had prepared another paper on the hidden value of the WTO, but just to remind everyone, and when we drafted it, we tried to think about a minister, thinking, who's really busy and with, perhaps bilateral negotiations and other things. And how do we remind, of the value that's there? Again, I'm not saying everything is perfect, far from it, but we live in a very imperfect world. And so in an imperfect situation, what is the best way to move forward? So, and can only just say is that from our perspective, we certainly are willing and would want to be there. And I know to work, we're ready to roll up our sleeves as well, as we move forward. So, wherever we can be helpful in the discussions moving forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And it is a very impressive paper, and important to take note of the fact that it has the support of a very broad spectrum of the business community, and it is the businesses that have to do the business of trade. So this is an extremely important perspective, and one that I hope all of us and all our governments will take carefully into consideration as that they approach the final preparations for this ministerial conference. I don't know whether anyone else has anything else they'd like to say. Any final word from our chairman? I just say, thinking about this and listening to what Alan said and thinking about working groups, at one point, I think he was suggesting we have I'm going to poke a bit of fun at you, Alan, that we have a secret working group to discuss the importance of transparency. But it seems to me that this is something that I wouldn't recommend this course to governments right now, but in terms of this group, I think quite clearly there's going to be a lot of things we're going to want to discuss after the Ministerial Conference. We won't predict the outcome at this point, but I think it's really important that we think I think this group will have an important role to play in that time space, whatever it is that happens. And so I think in due course, consideration should be given to what exactly it is that we should say, and where we might be able to make a valuable contribution to the next step, the next steps that the international community will be undertaking after that, after the meeting in Cameroon. So if there's nobody else who would like the floor, I think we could wrap up our discussion 6 minutes earlier than anticipated. Well, thank you all very much for your participation, and good luck to you all.
Thanks, John. Bye.
Thanks, John. Bye-bye.